Donbass 2014, How the War Began. Exactly 10 years ago, referendums on independence of the so-called DPR and LPR took place in parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine. The procedure had little in common with a legal expression of will. The independence of the People's Republics was not recognized by any UN member state until 2022. Nevertheless, the referendums became an important milestone in the development of the armed conflict in eastern Ukraine. Just 2 months later, a missile fired from territory controlled by the DPR shot down a Malaysian Boeing. The fighting over the course of 8 years up until the full-scale Russian invasion claimed thousands of lives. The BBC tells the story of the first months of unrest and military confrontation in Donbass in photographs. Since the spring of 2014, the regions in the east of Ukraine have been in turmoil and unrest has begun. The anti-Maidan movements, which gathered supporters of President Viktor Yanukovych, began to be strengthened by people and money from Russia. Then, under the cover of people's revolutions, parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions ceased to obey the authorities in Kiev. Immediately after the annexation of Crimea by the Little Green Men, the Kremlin did not immediately acknowledge the participation of Russian troops in the seizure of the peninsula. Clashes between demonstrators from local anti-Maidan protests and the authorities began in the major cities of eastern and southern Ukraine. The unrest engulfed Donetsk, Lugansk, Kharkov, and Odessa. The protests quickly became overgrown with Russian symbols and pro-Russian slogans. As the participants and organizers of these protests later recalled, Russia supported them with money and people. The level of aggression grew, and the Ukrainian authorities, shocked by the seizure of Crimea and the holding of a referendum there, often could not counter the anti-Maidans with anything other than unarmed police cordons. In several cases, demonstrators smashed police department buildings. The National Police of Ukraine was created in 2015, prosecutors' offices, and tore down Ukrainian flags from regional administrations. Already on April 7, a group of activists announced the creation of the Donetsk People's Republic. In Lugansk, a similar entity was proclaimed 3 weeks later on April 27. One of the key dates in the history of Russian aggression in Donbass in Ukraine is considered to be April 12, when several dozen well-armed people seized administrative buildings in Slavyansk. These people, many of whom were Russian citizens and had previously participated in the seizure of government bodies in Crimea, were commanded by Igor Strelkov Gherkin, a retired colonel of the Russian FSB. Later, he did not hide his participation in the seizure of Slavyansk. If our unit had not crossed the border, everything would have ended like in Kharkov, like in Odessa. There would have been several dozen killed, burned, arrested, and that would have been the end of it, he said. But as with the seizure of Crimea, Russia insisted that everything that was happening was purely an internal Ukrainian matter and an outburst of local discontent. In Slavyansk, the barricades at the entrance to the city were often guarded by civilians. It was difficult to establish where they were from and whether they were really locals. Within a few weeks, the authorities in Kiev lost control over the administrations in several other cities in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Dual power reigned in the regional centers. But the Ukrainian authorities no longer controlled the border with Russia in the Luhansk region, and through it, pro-Russian groups were supplied with weapons and fighters. Kiev's attempts to stop the change of power by force were unsuccessful. Poorly armed local units of the Ukrainian armed forces complained about the lack of clear orders, and often avoided armed confrontation with militiamen from among local residents or fighters from Russia imitating them. The authorities of the self-proclaimed entities used the beginning of May for mass marches in support of the People's Republics. In both, they were preparing for voting. When announcing the creation of the Donetsk People's Republic, it was announced that a referendum on self-determination of the DPR would be held. At the end of April, the LPR authorities also announced preparations for a similar vote. As in the case of the voting in Crimea, the referendums did not meet international standards at all. Naturally, there was no agreement on a plebiscite with the Ukrainian authorities. There was no equal opportunity for campaigning for opponents of the self-determining republics, and the security of the vote was not ensured. In the region where blood had already been shed, a mass exodus of the population began. The organizers of the referendum did not even have access to up-to-date data on voters. None of this prevented. On May 11, the so-called DPR and LPR held votes with an unclear number of participants and an opaque vote counting procedure. Their results resembled the outcome of the referendum in Crimea. The organizers announced that 89% of the DPR and 96% of the LPR supported the acts on state independence. On May 6, separatists in the DPR made their first attempt to seize the Prokofiev International Airport in Donetsk. The attack on the airport marked the first time that a large group of Russian troops had participated in fighting in eastern Ukraine, and it turned into a disaster. Dozens of people were killed at the airport and on the way back to the city by friendly fire from the Vostok Battalion, who mistook their fighters for Ukrainian units. The battle for the airport lasted 8 months, and in January 2015, the Ukrainian authorities admitted that they no longer controlled even the approaches to the airport. It was completely destroyed. By the end of May 2014, the unrecognized People's Republics controlled territories from the coast of the Sea of Azov to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and from the border with Russia in the Luhansk region to the western suburbs of Donetsk. Against this backdrop, presidential elections were held in the rest of Ukraine, which were won by Petro Poroshenko. Since early June, the Ukrainian authorities have begun to build up forces on the contact line with the rebellious regions. Negotiations with the unrecognized republics ended in nothing, and on July 1, after the end of the ceasefire declared by Kiev, the Ukrainian armed forces began shelling Donbass cities not controlled by the Ukrainian authorities. In early July, despite assistance with weapons and equipment from Russia, as a result of artillery shelling and airstrikes, the Donbass militia began to lose territory. In an attempt to slow the advance of Ukrainian troops towards Donetsk, separatists blew up bridges and mined fields and roads. Igor Strelkov, who by that time had become the Minister of Defense of the DPR, retreated to Donetsk, warning that the unrecognized republics were under threat of encirclement. One of the engines of the downed Malaysia Airlines MH17. On July 17, 2014, debris from a passenger airliner and the bodies of 298 people, its passengers and crew, flying on Malaysia Airlines Flight MH17 from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, fell to the ground in a field near the village of Grabovo. Intercepted telephone conversations between DPR military personnel and Strelkov and some curators in Russia showed that in the first minutes the separatists were sure that they had hit a Ukrainian military aircraft. Independent research has proven that the Boeing was fired at from a Buk air defense system delivered from Russia several hours earlier. The MH17 disaster was the world's worst incident involving the downing of a civilian airliner by military means. Russia has denied and continues to deny responsibility for the disaster. After several years of investigation, a court in the Netherlands confirmed that the missile at the Boeing was fired from territory controlled by the DPR, from a Buk missile launcher belonging to the 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade stationed in Kursk, delivered to the launch site on the day of the disaster, and removed from there at dawn the following day. In November 2022, a court in the Netherlands sentenced Igor Strelkov, as well as Sergei Dubinsky and Leonid Karchenko, in absentia to life imprisonment for attacking a civilian airliner and killing everyone on board. Dubinsky, a former Russian GRU officer, was the head of DPR intelligence, and Karchenko, a Ukrainian citizen, was his subordinate. Throughout July and early August, the Ukrainian army continued to push back the DPR and LPR forces and reached the borders of Donetsk from the north and west. By early August, the territory controlled by pro-Russian forces had shrunk fourfold compared to the beginning of the armed confrontation in April-May. Fearing the final defeat of separatist forces in Donbass, Moscow sent regular army units to help. As a result, a large detachment of the Ukrainian army was surrounded and routed near Ilovaisk, southeast of Donetsk. This defeat forced the Ukrainian authorities to start negotiations with the DPR and LPR, which ended with the signing of peace agreements in Minsk. The conflict in eastern Ukraine began to smolder. Russia managed to remain in the role of mediator, continuing to deny that it was supplying weapons and fighters to the separatist formations. At that time, no one, including the residents of Druzhkovka in the Donetsk region, could have known that these places would end up on the contact line between unrecognized republics in Ukraine for 8 years. Now Druzhkovka is subject to regular shelling by the Russian army, which is advancing on the positions of the Ukrainian armed forces in the third year of a full-scale military invasion of Ukraine. According to UN estimates, from spring 2014 to the end of 2021, the war in eastern Ukraine has claimed between 13,200 and 13,400 lives. Among them are 4,200 Ukrainian soldiers, 5,800 soldiers of the so-called DPR and LPR and servicemen of the Russian armed forces, and 3,390 civilians on both sides of the conflict.